They thought she was just another troubled teen in a hoodie, no lawyer, no parent, no chance. But when she stood up in that courtroom and calmly quoted a Supreme Court case, the entire room froze. Even the judge, known for silencing voices like hers, had no choice but to listen. What could a 16-year-old girl possibly say that would leave a courtroom speechless? At precisely 9:02 a.m., the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 3C creaked open, letting in a sliver of cold Kansas daylight and a sharp gust of tension. The air inside was heavy, not just from the age-old heater working overtime, but from judgment. The scent of varnished benches, old legal books, and polished marble hung like a weight above everyone's heads. People sat shoulder to shoulder, their coats tucked beside them, their whispers low and pointed. Most had come for traffic disputes or property violations, routine small-town cases in a quiet Midwestern county. But not this one. This case had drawn curiosity. And now, every eye in the room shifted to the girl walking in alone. Sierra James, just 16 years old, stepped into the courtroom of Prairieville Municipal Hall. She wasn't escorted by a lawyer. There was no parent holding her hand. Just a thin teenager with her hair tied back in a neat bun, a second-hand gray hoodie zipped to her throat, and scuffed white sneakers that squeaked ever so slightly with each step on the tile floor. She clutched a thin file of papers against her chest, photocopies, most of them, and kept her eyes ahead, scanning the courtroom like she was trying to find a corner that might feel safe. There wasn't one. Whispers followed her. "That's her," someone muttered. "She's the one who painted that thing on City Hall. The vandal. The one with the mural." A woman in the second row pulled out her phone, trying to snap a discreet photo. A man in the back snorted and shook his head. Sierra's walk didn't slow, but the fingers on her right hand twitched at her side, betraying the nerves beneath her quiet composure. At the front of the courtroom, beneath the tall windows lined with the county seal and the American flag, sat Judge Everett Langston. 62 years old, known for his strict rulings and zero tolerance for what he called performative resistance, Langston glanced over the rim of his glasses as Sierra approached the defendant's table. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. One brief glance. One raised brow. Then he looked back down at the file before him, as if the girl standing in front of him was already tried, sentenced, and dismissed. And maybe she was. Sierra sat down at the defendant's table without a word. She folded her hands in her lap. Her shoulders were squared, but there was something unmistakably fragile in the way she held her breath, like the walls themselves were pressing in, trying to suffocate her courage before it could take root. Outside, the morning sun shone gently on the frozen sidewalk, melting the tips of ice that had formed overnight. But inside the courtroom, it was storming, and the thunder was building behind Sierra's eyes. A moment later, the prosecutor stood. He was tall, pressed into a dark navy suit with the kind of effortless posture that made it seem like the courtroom was built around him. His name was David Harlan, and he'd been with the Prairieville County District Attorney's Office for nearly 12 years. He didn't look at Sierra. Not once. "Your Honor," he began, smooth and precise, "the facts of this case are straightforward." He turned slightly and motioned toward Sierra with the back of his hand, the way someone might gesture toward a stack of mail left out in the rain. The defendant deliberately defaced a government building in a calculated act of civil disobedience. He started to pace, slow and deliberate, the click of his dress shoes echoing across the stone floor like a drumbeat no one wanted to follow. She used spray paint 4 cans, according to surveillance footage, and applied a full-scale mural across the east-facing wall of Prairieville City Hall. There was a pause. Harlan turned his body back to the judge and narrowed his tone. Not random scribbles. Not gang tags. A mural. Graphic images of a man with his hands raised, shadowed by what appeared to be police lights. And beneath it, the words, "Do I look dangerous to you?" He let that sentence hang like smoke. People shifted in their seats. She didn't hide. She didn't run. This wasn't a mistake made in the heat of the moment. This was a public statement, made in broad daylight on taxpayer-funded property, no less. He stepped closer to the bench now, lowering his voice like he was revealing a secret. This isn't just about one girl and a can of paint, Your Honor. It's about a disturbing trend: young people, emboldened by social media platforms and cultural narratives, choosing protest over process. Choosing to challenge the very institutions designed to protect them. He pointed directly at Sierra for the first time. She's not here because of what she believes, Your Honor. She's here because of what she did. And what she did was illegal. He stepped back, folding his hands neatly in front of him, as if to signal he was done. Judge Langston didn't nod. He didn't blink. He simply removed his glasses and began polishing them with a small white cloth from his robe. Then, with a voice that sounded like dry gravel, he muttered, "So, she's a revolutionary now." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, dry, awkward laughs from those unsure whether the judge was joking or making an example. Langston didn't laugh. He leaned forward, clasping his hands on the bench. A teenager with a spray can and an overinflated sense of moral purpose, he said flatly. Then, for the first time since the hearing began, he looked Sierra James square in the eye. But it wasn't curiosity that filled his gaze. It was calculation. "Miss James," he said, "you're 16 years old. What exactly do you think you're fighting for?" Sierra opened her mouth slightly, but no words came. Langston didn't wait for an answer. He leaned back in his chair with the kind of theatrical exhaustion only power could afford. "We've created a generation that confuses emotion with principle," he said, more to the room than to Sierra. "They march, they chant, they paint on walls and call it progress." Silence settled across the room like a heavy tarp. Sierra sat still, hands in her lap, but her breath had changed. Quieter. Measured. Her fingers curled inward, just slightly, as if she were holding something no one else could see. In that moment, no one saw her as a girl trying to make a legal argument. They saw a defiant kid. A problem. A headline waiting to happen. But no one, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not even the spectators, had any idea that Sierra James wasn't here just to defend herself. She was here to test the system. To challenge its silence. To force it to look her in the eye. The silence sat heavy. No coughs. No whispers. Just the dull hum of the overhead lights and the sound of Sierra's breath, steady, but not relaxed. Then, softly, she stood. Not suddenly. Not in protest. Just enough to make her presence feel undeniable. "Your Honor," Sierra said, her voice low but sure, "may I speak?" Several heads turned. A few eyebrows lifted. Even the court clerk looked up from her laptop, surprised. Judge Langston didn't glance at her. He flipped through the pages on his desk, slow and dismissive. Then, like a whip crack, came his reply, "No." Just one word. But it hit like a closing door. Sierra blinked. Not from fear but calculation. She waited a beat, then tried again. "I'd like to explain why Langston snapped his eyes up. "Explain?" he repeated, like it was a ridiculous proposition. "This isn't a classroom, Miss James. This is a courtroom." Sierra's lips parted slightly, unsure if she should keep going. He didn't give her the chance. "This court is not here to entertain opinions or lectures. It exists to uphold law and deliver consequences. Your role today is not to educate us, but to listen." He leaned in, clasping his hands again. "You are here because you broke the law. Full stop. This room isn't a canvas for your philosophies." The words landed like bricks. A soft, involuntary gasp floated in from the back. Sierra didn't flinch. But her hands, resting on the defendant's table, had started to curl, her knuckles white, her nails pressing against her palms. She didn't look at Judge Langston. Or the prosecutor. Or the gallery. She stared ahead. At nothing. At everything. There was no anger on her face. No dramatic scowl. Just the sting of something deeper. Not outrage. Erasure. She had been spoken over, shut down, and filed away like a number on a docket. And still, Sierra didn't cry. She didn't lash out. She just folded her voice quietly back into her chest, the way her father once taught her, don't fight the silence. Wait for it to get scared of you. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who waits. The courtroom disappeared. Just for a moment. Sierra wasn't there anymore. She was 10 years old, curled on the floor of a modest one-bedroom apartment in Baxter Springs, a small Kansas town most maps didn't even label. There was a lopsided bookshelf next to the couch. The old one. The one that always tilted to the right, held together by duct tape and hope. Her father Samuel James sat beside her. A quiet man with rough hands and a smooth voice that made every word feel sacred. He used to be a U.S. history teacher until the district told him to tone it down during Black History Month. He didn't. So they let him go. But every night, he read to her. That evening, he had an old hardcover book in his lap. Pages yellowed, some torn, some taped. The spine was cracked, but the words inside were whole. This, he said, tapping the cover, is the real power, Sierra. Not yelling. Knowing. She had asked him, is it a storybook? No, he said, it's a book full of people who didn't stay quiet when silence was expected of them. People who used the law because they knew it better than the ones trying to control them. He read names that sounded like spells to her back then. Gideon versus Wainwright. Brown versus Board. Miranda versus Arizona. Tinker versus Des Moines. The last one stuck. A case about students who wore black armbands to protest a war, and the school tried to silence them. But the Supreme Court said their rights didn't stop at the schoolhouse door. That night, her dad had whispered to her, "Your voice is your inheritance, baby. Don't ever give it away. Not even when they demand it." Sierra hadn't fully understood it then. But now, sitting in this cold courtroom where her story had been muted before it was even read aloud, she did. Inside the pocket of her hoodie, Sierra's fingers touched the edge of a folded photocopy. It was the Tinker case worn thin from being unfolded and refolded, studied, and underlined. The same one her dad had given her when she was 12. She had carried it with her to every civics class, every town hall protest, every moment she questioned whether her voice had value. And now, she wasn't just carrying it. She was ready to use it. She pressed the paper flat against her leg, breathed in deep, and whispered only to herself, "They can ignore me. But they can't ignore the truth." She wasn't here to fight. She was here to win. Not for herself. Not entirely. But for the man who lost his job so she could keep her voice. And for every other girl in a hoodie, in a courtroom, whose truth had been discounted before it was ever spoken. At exactly 11:06 a.m., the courtroom reconvened. Same benches. Same polished floor. Same quiet murmur of half-curious, half-distracted strangers. But something had changed. Sierra James could feel it in the way the air moved, like the room had inhaled, waiting to exhale. She stepped through the double doors with her head held higher than before. She wasn't gripping her documents this time. She wasn't trembling. She was ready. As she took her seat at the defendant's table, she didn't adjust her hoodie or glance nervously around. Her fingers were relaxed. Her back straight. Her breathing, even. Judge Langston entered a moment later, robe trailing behind him, glasses already perched on the bridge of his nose. He didn't look at Sierra as he took his seat. "We'll resume," he said flatly, nodding toward Prosecutor Harlan. The man rose, preparing to continue his remarks until he noticed Sierra was already standing. Without waiting for permission. A rustle moved through the rows of observers. Some gasped. Others narrowed their eyes, unsure if this was courage or naivety. Langston's head tilted slowly toward her, one eyebrow arched in irritation. "Miss James," he said sharply, "you were not asked to speak." Sierra didn't blink. "I understand, Your Honor," she replied, voice even. "But if this court is going to determine my future, I believe I have the right to speak for myself." There was no anger in her tone. Just certainty. A murmur rippled again. This time louder. Langston opened his mouth to object but paused. He studied her longer than before, searching for rebellion in her eyes. He didn't find it. What he saw instead was something more dangerous to a man like him: resolve. Finally, with a sigh so faint it could have been a whisper, he muttered, 2 minutes. No more. Sierra nodded once, stepped forward, and reached into her hoodie pocket. She unfolded the sheet slowly, carefully. The edges were worn, nearly transparent from use. The kind of wear that suggested reverence, not carelessness. "I'd like to refer this court," she began, "to the 1969 Supreme Court ruling, Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District." Every sound in the courtroom ceased. Even the stenographer stopped typing. Sierra's voice grew stronger as she continued. "In that case, the court ruled, quote, students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. If that right exists inside a public school, then surely it does not vanish at the steps of City Hall. Langston leaned forward slightly. The calculating look had vanished. Now it was something else. Something closer to attention. Sierra turned the page in her hand, revealing a highlighted passage. "The mural I painted was not vandalism. It was protest. It was protected speech, just like Mary Beth Tinker's black armband. And if this court punishes me for that expression, then it doesn't just silence a teenager, it rewrites precedent." A hush fell. But this time, it wasn't the hush of dismissal. It was the silence that follows something undeniable. Langston stared at her for a long time. He didn't interrupt. He didn't deflect. He just looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Even Prosecutor Harlan had frozen, the next sheet of his notes still in hand, unread. And for the first time in the trial, Sierra James wasn't just a girl on trial. She was a legal mind. A speaker. A citizen standing on the foundation of the Constitution itself. No one smirked. No one scoffed. They listened. And the silence that followed was not awkward. It was respect. In the back row, behind a column of folded arms and downturned heads, a woman named Monica Ruiz lowered the pen she had been nervously tapping. She was a reporter for the Baxter County Gazette, assigned to cover routine docket stories, shoplifting, traffic disputes, minor defacements. But as she watched Sierra, something shifted in her chest. Something old. Something that had been quiet for too long. Years ago, Monica had been a political science major at Kansas State. She had taken classes from a man named Samuel James, Sierra's father. He used to say things like, "The Constitution doesn't care about your status. It cares about your voice." And, "The First Amendment doesn't require a microphone, just the courage to speak." Back then, she believed him. She believed in that kind of justice. But years of seeing voices drowned out had chipped away at her fire. Until now. Now she sat in stunned silence, watching his daughter do what most adults never dared: hold the law up like a mirror to power. Monica stood, slipped out of the room, and sprinted across the courthouse lawn toward her car. She wasn't going to file a paragraph. She was going to write a front-page headline. Judge Langston sat still for what felt like a full minute. He didn't reach for his gavel. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't even blink. The photograph of the mural entered into evidence earlier that morning rested just inches from his right hand. The same photo he had barely glanced at before. Now, he looked at it as if seeing it through entirely new eyes. A man, painted in shades of shadow and flame. Hands raised. Eyes wide. Beneath him, 5 chilling words, "Do I look dangerous to you?" Langston picked up the photo gently, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. But not like evidence. Like something heavier. More human. Up in his chambers, during the lunch recess, the judge sat alone. No staff. No clerks. No attorneys buzzing in and out with motions or memos. Just silence. And the image of that mural burned into the back of his mind. For most of his 23-year career, Judge Everett Langston had prided himself on efficiency. He delivered verdicts like blueprints, clean, measured, unemotional. Justice was a matter of rules, not feelings. But now, he found himself thinking not about the rulebook, but about regret. Not loud, dramatic regret. The quiet kind. The kind that lingers behind confident decisions and waits for you in the silence. He remembered another case. 5 years ago. A 17-year-old boy pulled over for erratic driving. No dashcam. Conflicting testimonies. The boy was handcuffed. Claimed he was roughed up. Langston ruled against him. Then another. A single mother arrested for disturbing the peace at a school board meeting. Langston barely read her statement. Dismissed her as angry, irrational. Then another. And another. They all blurred together now, not because they were forgettable but because he'd never really tried to remember them. But Sierra James? She was unforgettable. And worse, she had quoted the law better than most lawyers. Calmly. Fearlessly. Publicly. Around 12:37 p.m., a deputy knocked once, poked his head in, and said carefully, "Sir. You may want to see this." Langston looked up. The young deputy held up a phone screen. It displayed a news article from the Baxter County Gazette. Headline bold in black, 16-year-old defends mural with Supreme Court case, courtroom stunned. Beneath it, a photo of Sierra, mid-sentence, eyes forward, paper in hand. Unafraid. Langston waved the deputy away. He didn't need the internet to tell him what had just happened. Because it hadn't just happened in the court of public opinion. It had happened inside him. For the first time in years, he felt the foundations shift, not from pressure, but from truth. Back in the courtroom, Sierra waited. She had returned to her seat after delivering her 2 minutes. Her fingers no longer trembled. Her eyes weren't scanning the room for safety. She had become her own safe space. The gallery behind her had grown quiet. Not indifferent. Not bored. Reverent. Some had tears in their eyes. Others looked down, ashamed of what they had assumed when they first saw her walk through those doors. No one said a word. They didn't need to. At 1:07 p.m., the chamber doors opened. Judge Langston walked back in slower this time. Not tired. Not unsure. Just changed. He took his seat, adjusted his robe, and looked directly at Sierra James. "Miss James," he began, voice low but unmistakably clear, "I've taken this recess to reflect. Not on social media. Not on the article that's now circulating. But on what happened in this courtroom, on what I chose not to hear, and what you chose to say anyway." A few people leaned forward in their seats. Langston continued. "I have presided over thousands of cases. I have handed down rulings that shaped lives and dismissed arguments that lacked legal merit. But today, I dismissed you. Not because you failed to present logic, but because I assumed based on your age, your appearance, your background that your voice didn't matter." He held up the photo of the mural now. "And yet, here it is, staring back at me. Demanding not just to be seen but to be understood." He paused. The room didn't move. Langston set the photo down gently, then said, "This court hereby dismisses all charges against Sierra James." But he wasn't finished. He looked at the court clerk and added, "And let the record show, it is the recommendation of this court that the mural in question remain untouched. Let it stand not as defacement, but as declaration. A reminder that courage does not always shout. Sometimes, it simply refuses to sit down." No one applauded. No one needed to. Because something bigger than a verdict had just happened. A system had listened. And a girl had made it happen. Sierra didn't cry. She didn't smile either. She simply nodded once like someone who had always known the truth and was just waiting for the world to catch up to it. Judge Langston tapped his gavel with quiet finality, the sound softer than before. Almost respectful. The courtroom didn't erupt in cheers. It didn't have to. Because the silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was sacred. When Sierra stepped outside the courthouse, the Kansas wind met her first. It tugged lightly at the hem of her hoodie, carrying with it the scent of winter grass and the distant hum of traffic along Main Street. The sky was wide and impossibly blue. Reporters were lined up along the stone steps, cameras poised, microphones extended, but no one shouted. Not one person barked questions. They watched. Not as vultures circling a story, but as people witnessing a moment they'd never forget. For once, the world didn't see a defendant walking out of a courtroom. They saw a voice that refused to be erased. And then she saw him. Standing quietly beneath the courthouse oak tree. Gray sweater. Slacks that didn't quite fit. A leather-bound book tucked under one arm. Samuel James. Her father. His eyes were glassy, but his hands were steady. His back straight. And when Sierra's eyes locked with his, it felt like the entire world stopped breathing for half a second. She walked toward him. No rush. No collapse into tears. Just steps. Measured. Certain. When she reached him, he opened his arms without a word. And Sierra stepped into them. He held her tight. Like someone trying to keep all the broken pieces of the past from falling again. He didn't say, "I'm proud of you." He didn't have to. Instead, he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, "You did it, baby. You finished what I couldn't. You made them stop. You made them listen." Sierra didn't respond. Because some truths live better in silence. Across town, in a quiet cafe near 4th Street, copies of the Baxter County Gazette were already being laid out on counters. Customers read the headline over their coffee: "Teenager wins courtroom battle over mural, judge overturns case, cites constitutional rights." There was a photo underneath. It wasn't dramatic. No crying. No fist in the air. Just Sierra, standing with her father beneath that tree. A folded document still clutched in her hand. Her eyes forward. The mural remained untouched. It stood proudly on the side of City Hall, bold, raw, unapologetic. The man's painted eyes still looked out across the street, arms raised, frozen in both surrender and defiance. Beneath him, the words hadn't faded, "Do I look dangerous to you?" But now, something else had changed. Tourists came to see it. Students were assigned to study it. Local residents, some of whom had once called it graffiti, now brought their kids to take photos in front of it. It had become a landmark. Not because it was beautiful. But because it was true. And every morning, just after sunrise, Judge Everett Langston changed his route. Instead of parking in the west lot of the courthouse, he took the longer walk through downtown. Not out of habit. Out of intent. Each day, he passed by the mural. He never touched it. Never spoke to it. But he always paused. Just long enough to look. Just long enough to remember. Not just the 5 words that had shattered his courtroom. But the hundreds of voices he had silenced before he ever heard them speak. The law was still the law. But now, so was she. People still debate what happened that day. Some call it a media stunt. Others call it clever defense. But those who were there, those who listened, they say it was something else. A recalibration. A reminder that justice isn't static. It doesn't live inside old books and black robes. Sometimes it comes from a girl in a hoodie. Sometimes it sounds like 2 minutes of borrowed breath. And sometimes, it looks like 5 painted words that cut deeper than any gavel ever could.